Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. The Erbwife's Ledger, Healing with Roots and Ritual. In the shadowed folds of a forested English village, around the year 1283, a woman called Godleva moved quietly between her garden and her work table. She was not a doctor, few in her village even knew such a title. They called her Erbwife, wise woman, or sometimes less kindly witch. Her ledger, a worn set of folded vellum pages wrapped in cloth, held dozens of handwritten notations: crushed yarrow for nosebleeds, foxglove for swelling, betony for dreams. Most villagers could not read them. Most did not need to. You would not have noticed her walking past the sheep pens. She wore undyed wool and carried a basket for roots. Yet nearly every woman in the hamlet had passed through her door. For childbirth, for fevers, for secret consultations whispered in the hush of superstition and fear. There is a particular boredom to her world. No grand battles, no courtly intrigue, just long days of drying herbs, boiling resins, and walking to the edge of the marsh to gather eyebright. And yet, her practice preserved lives. In a time when male university-trained physicians dismissed most women's health concerns as hysteria, the Erbwife filled the space between ignorance and experience. The physical practice of herblore. Godleva's home was both her apothecary and her study. Unlike later physicians who prized Latin terminology and university credentials, her knowledge was tactile. She learned from her grandmother. She felt the ridges of marshmallow roots, tasted the bitterness of feverfew, smelled the bruised mint on her hands. In early spring, she foraged violet and coltsfoot for coughs. By midsummer, her shelves were heavy with comfrey, rosemary, and tansy. In winter, she relied on her preserved stores: roots pickled in vinegar, dried leaves suspended in wax-sealed jars. The ledger, which she copied from her mentors, contained not just treatments but warnings. Rue in heat may scourge the belly. Black nightshade kills if the moon is fat. None of this was mystical, though it sounded like it. The moon phases, the humors, the shifting qualities of heat, cold, dryness, and moisture, these framed her diagnoses. A child with a wet cough was treated with drying herbs. A man with melancholy believed to have too much black bile might receive warming spices and encouragement to walk in sunlight. And still, this was a system based more on careful observation than magic. When a baby's rash worsened after being swaddled with elder leaves, she noted it. When a woman miscarried after taking pennyroyal, she etched a line in the margins of her ledger and whispered her regret to no one. Community and quiet power. Her presence in the village was both needed and feared. Though she was not wealthy, she held a kind of quiet influence. The Reeve's wife came to her for dropsy. The miller's son was swaddled in her mustard poultice when his cough turned ragged. The church tolerated her barely. As long as she did not speak against priestly authority or claim miraculous cures, she was allowed to work. In fact, many of her treatments mirrored those of the monks in nearby abbeys. They shared knowledge through veiled channels, monks copying old Roman herbal texts, women like Godleva translating that knowledge into earthy mixtures and trial-based dosing. Still, the line between healer and heretic was fine. She kept her ledger hidden beneath her rush mattress. If a neighbor's child died, she might be blamed. If a woman died in childbirth after consulting her, rumors could fester. Yet in quiet ways, her presence ensured a kind of medical continuity. In a time when trained physicians were few, expensive, and often useless, the herb wife created a buffer against complete helplessness. Her skill was measured not in prestige, but in returning a feverish child to calm sleep. Methods, measurements, and margins of error. The measurements she used were not precise: a pinch, a dram, the length of a nail. She worked by weight, smell, texture. There were no scales. Doses were adjusted for age, for body type, even for temperament. A choleric man might be given more cooling herbs than a phlegmatic one. A woman prone to sadness might receive St. John's wort steeped in honey. Water was boiled not by degrees, but until it sings. Leaves were steeped, as long as it takes to pray the Pater Noster twice. These approximations, though inconsistent, were often more adaptable than the rigid prescriptions later adopted by formal medicine. The error rate was real. Some herbs were toxic. Mistaking one plant for another could be deadly. But these women developed a kind of localized precision. They knew their soil. They knew the subtle differences between healing and harm because they had seen both. A story passed in fragments. We don't have Godleva's full name. Her ledger may have been burned, lost, or misattributed to a monk. But thousands of similar records, fragments of parchment, glosses in margins, annotations in recipe books show us that women like her were common across Europe. Their history is largely invisible because it was not preserved in official archives. No one inscribed their wisdom in stone or marble, but their fingerprints are everywhere on the herbal compendia of the 14th century, in the shifting prescriptions of country doctors, and in the folkloric remedies that persist today. What does it mean that the most consistent healthcare providers of medieval Europe left almost no names behind? And what exactly did Godleva write in that ledger on the winter night when the snow sealed every door and the fever spread across the valley? When we return to Godleva's world, the winter has settled into bone. The wind hisses through the wooden shutters of her cottage, and the path to the river has hardened with frost. The herbal jars on her shelf have grown quieter, used slowly as the cold months starve the land of green life. And now, sickness has come, not just the sniffles and winter chill, but something deeper, spreading in the lungs, curling into the joints, taking children before they speak their first words. In these moments, the role of the herb wife becomes something more than a supplier of teas and ointments. She becomes, to the village, the sole hope, the difference between a shallow grave and a mother's second chance. She moves from home to home, her steps muffled by thick-soled boots, her hands stained with the oils of fennel and elecampane. But how does one heal when the language of medicine is limited, when most knowledge lives in oral repetition, and when symptoms are often explained not by germs or viruses, but by sin, imbalance, or a passing curse? Let's follow her into the home she visits. The homes of the sick. The thatched cottages of the 13th century were not built with airflow in mind. Windows were scarce and ventilation was poor. Smoke lingered, moisture seeped in through the walls. In these cramped, dark spaces, disease found perfect ground. Children shared straw pallets. Livestock might sleep in the same room as their owners. Water was often drawn from shallow wells, easily tainted by runoff. Godleva enters one such home. A child burns with fever. The parents have tried placing a damp rag on his forehead. A bowl of onions and vinegar sits beneath the bed, a folk method to draw out illness. The child's lips are cracked. The cough rattles like dry leaves. She observes, asks no questions. She pulls from her pouch a mixture of horehound and hyssop. These are expectorants herbs that help loosen mucus. She crushes them between two flat stones, adds hot water, and lets the steam rise into the child's face. If the fever persists, she will recommend a compress of willow bark on the wrists. If the cough thickens, she may offer a syrup brewed from licorice root and honey. She leaves no guarantees, only soft-spoken instructions, a small blessing under her breath, and the quiet rhythm of repetition, doing what has worked before and hopping it works again. Healing as observation. Godleva has no access to microscopy, no knowledge of bacteria, and no concept of viruses. Yet her healing is not blind. It is deeply observational. She notices patterns: illness after the rains, rashes following certain meals, fevers that run through families like fire. She watches the reactions to herbs, when burdock eases a stomach but causes a rash, when angelica root calms some patients and sends others into hallucination. Her ledger, folded tightly under her sleeping mat, is a record not just of what she's learned but how. It contains failures written in plain script. Child of Edric taken after foxglove, gave only a thimbleful but breath slowed. The margins of that page are smudged with oil. She kept reading that entry, reminding herself, learning from the edge of death. She knew, too, that some illnesses were beyond her. Wasting fevers, festering wounds, sudden seizures. These she attributed to God's will or perhaps a crossing of spirits. Sometimes she would recommend prayer. Other times she would step away entirely. Knowing when to say no was as vital as knowing which herb to grind. Herbal knowledge and church doctrine. Despite the church's growing disapproval of unlicensed healers, particularly women, there was a curious tolerance in many rural areas. Parish priests often relied on herbwives themselves. Monastic infirmaries kept elaborate herb gardens, guided by texts like the Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess who blended theology and botany. But suspicion lingered. Godleva sometimes used chants, not because she believed in their magic, but because the patient expected it. A mother would not feel truly protected until the healer whispered over her child's brow. A farmer would not drink the tonic unless it had been marked with the sign of the cross, even if that cross was traced by fingers stained with nettle oil. To survive as a healer was to walk a careful line, embracing enough piety to avoid accusation, while preserving knowledge that predated the church's reach. She had heard of other women, one burned near York, another fined in Shrewsbury accused of sorcery. The real reason: a healing gone wrong, a child died, a man convulsed after a tincture of belladonna. The punishment was not always legal. Sometimes it came as silence, doors that no longer opened, eyes that watched too long, whispers in the village square. Plants trade, and the flow of forgotten knowledge. Godleva's knowledge was not static. Even in isolated areas, information traveled. A passing merchant might bring dried myrrh. A widow from a coastal town might share a salve used by fishermen's wives. Monks might allow a peek at a copied page of Galen or Dioscorides, names she could not pronounce but recognized as ancient. Some of her herbs were local: mugwort, burdock, plantain. Others came from farther, cloves traded from the east, cinnamon bark, camphor wrapped in linen. She couldn't afford much, but when she did, she treated them like gold. By combining these new ingredients with her old rituals, she evolved her treatments. Slowly, organically. There were no laboratories, only the bodies of the sick and the quiet prayers of their caretakers. Facing the winter plague. It was not the Black Death, still decades away, but a local pestilence. The sickness that struck Godleva's village that winter of 1283 seemed to settle in the lungs. Children fell first, then older men, then, one day, her own apprentice. Ulrich was 17, lanky, with a mouth always dry from chewing birch twigs. He had learned quickly, taken to pressing herbs into pastes with a careful hand. He had started copying from her ledger in cleaner script. It was Ulrich who suggested storing valerian root in wine for longer shelf life. She had started relying on him more than she realized. When his breath turned shallow, when his eyes glazed and his cough deepened, she tried everything. Yarrow compresses, onion broth with mustard seed, a pillow of dried eucalyptus imported from distant hands for its sharp, clearing scent. Nothing worked. 3 days later, he died. She didn't record his death in the ledger until weeks later. When she did, she wrote, "Ulrich, too much moisture in the lungs, chest rattled like seed pod, fever burned for 2 days, could not pull it out." She underlined the last sentence 3 times. Then she wrote no entries for a month. Grief and the healer. For all her patience, her herbs, her tiny victories, death was a frequent companion. Healing in the medieval world was not about defeating illness, but delaying it, redirecting it, soothing it. Godleva grieved quietly. She did not attend Ulrich's burial. She was called to another home that day, a newborn girl with blue skin. She rubbed the child's feet with mustard oil, wrapped her in warmed linen, and waited. The child cried. That was enough for that day. Sometimes she believed healing was not in the treatment, but in the presence, in the act of sitting, of watching, of knowing that someone cared enough to try. There were days she wanted to stop, to walk into the forest and not return, but then someone knocked, always someone, a boy with boils, a woman with labor pains, an old man asking for something to ease his sleep. And so she boiled water, crushed bark, whispered charms, opened her door once again. When spring came, she harvested early nettles with swollen knuckles. She added a new section to her ledger, wheezing plague effects, signs, failures. She made note of the body types that survived, the treatments that did nothing, and those that maybe, just maybe, had helped. Why do we keep trying to heal when healing is so often impossible? And what will someone, centuries later, make of a worn ledger stained with fever, grief, and marigold oil? As the 13th century drew to a close, Europe stood unknowingly on the threshold of great upheaval. War, famine, and eventually plague would ripple through towns and villages like the one where Godleva lived. But on the morning after a long winter illness season, when the sky turned from slate gray to something faintly golden, she stepped outside and touched the first budding leaf of coltsfoot. It was time to begin again. This final chapter in Godleva's story is not marked by a dramatic ending. Like most healers of her kind, she did not die a martyr, nor did she live to see her name enshrined in illuminated texts. But her work, the ledger she kept, the treatments she whispered, the quiet knowledge passed on to others left an enduring trace, not in legend, but in lineage. A ledger passed down. The vellum pages she'd so carefully annotated began to crack at the edges. Over time, perhaps, she passed them to another. Not a daughter, for she never had children, but maybe a niece or a neighbor's daughter, one who had followed her through hedgerows and watched her fingers tie bundles of drying wormwood with rush twine. This new healer would add her own notes, scribble in the margins, translate some of the older entries into the changing dialect of the region. The ledger would no longer be only Godleva's, it would evolve, stitched together from many women's hands. Such ledgers were rarely preserved in libraries. They weren't seen as medical texts in the scholastic sense. Monks might copy sections, inserting useful herbal recipes into broader compilations. Sometimes, male physicians would lift treatments directly from these sources, presenting them in Latinized form with little credit. But mostly, they survived as domestic objects tucked between sacks of barley and bundles of dried sage. If a ledger like Godleva's survived, it would show a world of care shaped by necessity, trial, and profound attentiveness. In its pages, the line between science and survival would be thin and constantly shifting. An underground network of healers. Though often isolated geographically, the herb wives of medieval Europe were never truly alone in knowledge. A slow, underground network of exchange moved between villages, markets, and even pilgrimage routes. A passing merchant might share a story of a miracle cure from across the channel. A pilgrim from Spain might trade a pinch of saffron for a salve of marigold wax. A traveling friar more lenient than his superior might offer a discarded scrap of text copied from an Arabic medical manuscript translated in Toledo. Bit by bit, knowledge migrated. Recipes were altered, measurements adapted. These women, despite being dismissed in public discourse, were in fact early practitioners of what we might now call applied medical ethnobotany. They built archives with their hands, not in stone halls but in habit. And within this network, an idea persisted. that to tend to the sick was not an act of grandeur, but of endurance. The turning tide, male physicians and institutional medicine. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, formal medical practice began to harden into something more exclusionary. University-trained physicians, increasingly male and Latin literate, gained authority through guilds and ecclesiastical support. Licenses were required, practices were scrutinized, and women, particularly those not of noble birth, were increasingly pushed to the margins. In cities like Paris and Bologna, healing was becoming professionalized. Midwives required approval from magistrates. Herbalists had to register their goods. The empirical knowledge passed down through generations was seen as dangerous, unreliable, untested, and worst of all, unmonetized. This was not a sudden erasure but a slow squeezing out. Herbwives still practiced, especially in rural areas, but the scrutiny intensified. If a woman saved a child, she was lucky. If she failed, she was suspect. In this changing climate, Goldleva's legacy, her ledger, her methods, her quiet interventions became less a public record and more an underground current, a hidden thread in the tapestry of history. The science behind the simplicity. Modern historians and pharmacologists who have studied these old herbwives' remedies are often surprised by how many were effective. Willow bark, used by Goldleva for fever and swelling, contains salicin chemically similar to aspirin. Honey and onion, her go-to expectorant syrup, have proven antibacterial properties. Even her mustard oil foot rub, used to stimulate circulation, aligns with principles of warming and drawing blood to extremities. It would be romantic but false to say she knew these things the way we do today. She did not understand molecules or immune systems, but she knew what worked and what didn't. She adjusted, observed, tested. In this way, she practiced a form of empirical medicine long before it was recognized by institutions. And her failures, though painful, were lessons. Written down, remembered, whispered across generations. Medicine was, for her, a conversation with suffering. From forgotten to found, rediscovering the herbwife. In the early 20th century, as scholars began re-examining the margins of medieval history, a few odd texts surfaced in museum collections. Herbal recipe books in plain Middle English, anonymous notations in the back pages of religious texts, fragments of instructions for salves and stews, written in feminine hands. Historians began to ask, who wrote these? Why were they not cited? Why do they lack attribution? It became clear that these were the voices of women like Goldleva, healers, midwives, herbwives who formed an invisible layer of medieval life. They were never intended to be remembered, and yet some fragments survived. One such note, preserved in the Wellcome Library in London, reads, "For sweet breath, chew anise and fennel. For eyes sore and watering, soak in chamomile and lie in shadow." There is no name, just instructions, but within the choice of words and the clarity of care, one sees the ghost of Goldleva, an unacknowledged lineage of science, carried by quiet hands. A final reflection, the endurance of care. As we step away from this story, you may feel underwhelmed. No grand conclusion, no fiery death, no single moment of revolution, just a woman who lived, healed, and died without fanfare. But perhaps that is the point. The history of medicine is often told through breakthroughs: penicillin, antiseptics, anesthesia. Yet between each milestone, there were centuries of tending, failing, and trying again. Goldleva represents the long, slow arc of care, the boring, repetitive, humble labor of noticing what helps and what harms. And in a way, isn't that what survival is? Not grand victories, but the accumulation of tiny, quiet acts of resistance against the inevitability of illness. So as you drift into sleep, consider this. What other stories remain hidden, tucked between folds of cloth and stained pages, waiting to be heard not for their drama, but for their diligence? And in our age of advanced medicine, Do we still value the quiet, observational wisdom of the Godlevas of the world? Story 2. Blood and Leechcraft. Inside a monastic infirmary. Imagine, if you will, the damp quiet of a Benedictine monastery in the early 12th century. Thick stone walls block the wind. Candles flicker down the long nave. A bell tolls in the distance, not a call to war or trade, but to prayer. Amid this schedule of devotion, copying manuscripts and growing vegetables, a separate order of work is quietly unfolding. You walk down a side passage, past the scriptorium, and through a wooden door into the infirmary. It smells of rosemary, vinegar, sweat, and something faintly metallic. This is where monks come to die, to recover, or simply to be examined, whether with hope or resignation. This is not a hospital as you know it. It is not designed for the masses. The poor are served elsewhere, in separate halls if they are lucky. Here, the care is for fellow brothers monks whose bodies must be preserved, not just for their own sake, but for the stability of the religious institution itself. You may be surprised to find that this space is, in some ways, among the most medically advanced in Europe at the time. The monastic infirmary, layout and function. The infirmarium, as it was known in Latin, was more than a sick room. In larger monasteries, particularly those affiliated with the Benedictine order, the infirmary operated as a semi-independent unit. It had its own garden, kitchen, apothecary, and chapel. Monks who entered the infirmary were often treated not only for acute illness but for chronic conditions: old age, lameness, respiratory troubles made worse by incense and cold stone. The infirmary was a place of bodily failure but also, oddly, of rest. Here, a monk might escape some of the rigorous daily routine: fewer prayers, more food, a bed to oneself. The infirmerer or infirmarius was the monk in charge. This was not an amateur role. Though he was not a doctor by our standards, he often had access to medical texts and, more importantly, the freedom to apply what he read. He observed, he recorded, he adjusted treatments. In some cases, monastic infirmaries became hubs of medical experimentation quietly and without fanfare. Daily routines, between devotion and discomfort. Life in the infirmary followed a schedule as regimented as the abbey's liturgy: waking, prayer, examination. Herbs were brewed at dawn: fennel and mugwort for digestion, poppy if pain was great enough. The patients were offered warm food: stewed barley, goat's milk, poached apples if their stomachs allowed it. Ailments were categorized based on the ancient Greek theory of humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. A monk with a hacking cough was considered phlegmatic and was treated with drying herbs like sage and hyssop. A brother suffering melancholy might be given warming infusions, perhaps wine laced with cinnamon or rosemary. Monks in the infirmary were usually exempt from matins, the night prayers, and other rigorous rituals. Instead, they were encouraged to read scripture, meditate, and confess frequently. Healing was not only of the body, but of the soul. Yet this reprieve came at a cost. To be in the infirmary too long was to risk suspicion. A malingering monk might be viewed as lacking discipline or, worse, humility. Illness was seen as both divine punishment and divine opportunity. Bloodletting and leechcraft. Perhaps the most defining treatment of monastic medicine was bloodletting. Based on centuries of inherited Greco-Roman logic, particularly the writings of Galen, the monks believed that illnesses stemmed from imbalances in the body's humors, and the way to restore that balance: remove excess blood. Phlebotomy was practiced on a seasonal schedule. In some monasteries, monks were bled up to 4 times a year as part of routine health. Special calendars marked bleeding days, and entire weeks were adjusted to accommodate recovery. The procedure was methodical: a shallow incision in the forearm or behind the knee, a brass basin to catch the blood, a clean linen to bind the wound. Sometimes, if bloodletting was not advisable or too risky, leeches were applied instead. Leeches were collected from nearby marshes, stored in jars, and applied carefully. Monks believed in their power not just because of observed relief, but because of theological logic: cleansing, expiation, suffering. Illness, like sin, had to be drawn out. Medical knowledge and the cloistered library. While rural herbwives practiced by observation and memory, monastic infirmaries often had access to written medical texts. Some of the most well-known manuscripts were copied in these very cloisters. Works by Galen, Hippocrates, and Arabic physicians such as Avicenna and Al-Razi. The Canon of Medicine and Liber Pantagni, translated from Arabic into Latin, circulated among elite monasteries by the 12th century. These texts blended classical theory with real-world remedies: compresses, purgatives, baths, and dietary regimens. In this setting, literacy was power. A monk who could read Latin and had access to texts could adapt a Greek recipe for a balm using local herbs. He could compare notes across centuries, even languages. The result was not innovation, but preservation, a quiet effort to keep the old knowledge alive through centuries of upheaval. Yet even with books in hand, monks rarely strayed from traditional medical doctrine. Experimentation was subtle. Changes were made slowly. Authority came from the ancients and from God. Between healing and mortality. Despite their access to texts and treatments, monks still died frequently. Disease, particularly tuberculosis, intestinal infections, and seasonal fevers, was rampant. Communal living, shared utensils, and cold interiors made monasteries fertile grounds for illness. When death approached, the infirmary became a sacred space. The dying brother would be anointed with oil. Fellow monks would gather to sing the Commendatio Animi, the commendation of the soul. Death was not feared, but it was not ignored either. Some monks, sensing their end, would refuse further treatment. They would ask only for prayer and quiet. Others clung to remedies until the final day, hopeful that even a new tonic or poultice might restore them for one more season of labor and prayer. Often the infirmary would record these deaths in the abbey's necrology. A brief line: Brother Thomas passed on the feast of St. Cuthbert, having suffered a wound to the liver. A sentence, and then silence. The place of the poor. You might wonder, were these infirmaries ever open to common people? In rare cases, yes. Particularly charitable monasteries established guest halls or hospicia where the poor or pilgrims could receive basic care, food, rest, and sometimes rudimentary treatment. But the central infirmary remained largely reserved for monks. This boundary between sacred and secular medicine would widen in later centuries, especially after the Black Death. But in the 12th century, healing was still seen as a spiritual act, one best confined to those already inside the cloister. A quiet observation. The monastic infirmary reveals something quiet but profound. Even in an age of limited scientific knowledge, care was considered sacred. Not perfect, not effective by modern standards, but sacred nonetheless. Every compress, every prayer, every cup of warmed wine was a ritual part of the grand cycle of work and worship. Healing was not about eradicating disease, but enduring it with grace. And so, by firelight, the infirmary might read a line from Galen, boil fennel root, bleed a monk, and then kneel in prayer. All in one afternoon, all with the steady rhythm of belief. Yet one wonders, with all their books and rituals, did they ever question the bleeding, the leeches, the failure of prayer to stop a plague? Did any monk, alone in the candlelight, ever doubt whether all this knowledge amounted to healing or only to distraction from death? The infirmary lies still in the hours before matins. The wind scratches softly at the shuttered windows, and a single candle glows beside the bed of a sleeping monk. The infirmerer, Brother Reginald, has been awake for some time. He stirs the last of a comfrey root paste and listens to the faint wheeze of Brother Alfric, who has not spoken in days. His breathing is shallow, like reeds shifting in wind. This section steps deeper into the life of the infirmary, the monk tasked with holding body and spirit in delicate balance. A figure of discipline, faith, and early science, his role is complex. He is not a physician in the secular sense, yet he administers treatment, records symptoms, and reflects quietly on the meaning of suffering. He must reconcile the tension between divine will and the desire to heal between the patient's soul and their stomach. As you follow Brother Reginald's footsteps through the halls of a Benedictine monastery in the mid-1100s, you'll see that the practice of medicine in a monastic setting was not stagnant. It was filled with decisions, compromises, quiet questioning, and more than a little human struggle. The making of an infirmary. Reginald was not chosen for his medical brilliance. Rather, he was chosen for his temperament steady, quiet, obedient. He had been a monk for many years before being named infirmary. His knowledge came slowly, first from observation, then from copying Latin texts, and finally from tending real bodies. To be an infirmary was to carry both authority and accountability. He was responsible for monitoring the sick and elderly monks, preparing and administering treatments, managing the infirmary garden, maintaining stocks of herbs, oils, and bandages, deciding when a monk should enter or leave the infirmary, recording deaths and chronic conditions, balancing treatment with religious obligation. It was a role that required not just knowledge but judgment. Too much intervention risked pride usurping God's will. Too little risked negligence. It was a daily exercise in humility. The herbal garden, medicine in living form. Just outside the infirmary door, bordered by a low stone wall and a few gnarled apple trees, was the herbularius, the infirmary garden. Reginald kept rows of fennel, comfrey, mallow, sage, and horehound. Taller plants like angelica and elecampane grew along the edges. In the spring, violets and borage. In autumn, rue and lovage. He dried the herbs in bundles hung from the rafters, labeled them in Latin, and stored them in clay jars on shelves beside the apothecary table. Each plant had a personality, a history. Yarrow was used to staunch wounds applied with linen strips. Wormwood aided digestion and was steeped in wine. Hyssop, considered purifying, was boiled into a tonic for cough. Valerian soothed nerves, though too much caused unsettling dreams. The Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, a popular medical poem originating from the medical school of Salerno, circulated among literate monks. It offered advice on everything from diet to bloodletting schedules. Reginald had copied parts of it into his personal notebook, right beside notes on which Brother reacted poorly to horehound syrup. This notebook, though never destined for publication, was a kind of practical compendium, a living record of monastic medicine in motion. Common illnesses and gentle remedies. The illnesses Reginald saw were predictable. They followed seasons and cycles. Catarrh and chills in the winter. Stomach ailments in spring from new shoots and spoiled grains. Insect bites and fevers in summer. Joint pain and melancholy in autumn. He treated toothaches with clove oil and firm prayer. Constipation with mashed figs or bran gruel. Insomnia with warm goat's milk laced with lavender or lettuce seed extract. Gout, a disease of the wealthy, was treated with cooling herbs and admonitions against gluttony. When monks suffered mental distress, Reginald would sit with them. He would offer calming tonics, a psalm to memorize, or advice to walk in the garden. He saw melancholy not as sin, but as imbalanced something that could be soothed as well as confessed. For wounds or infections, he used honey, vinegar, and ground plantain, a natural antiseptic combination, though he did not know the term. He simply knew it worked more often than it failed. Still, treatment was slow. Relief came over days, not hours. There was no penicillin, no surgery in the modern sense. When a monk's fever subsided or his swelling diminished, Reginald saw it as the grace of God working through herbs. Balancing faith with treatment. The core tension of Reginald's work was this: was he healing or interfering? Many believed that suffering was redemptive, that it drew one closer to God. If a monk survived a grave illness, it was not the herbs that saved him, it was divine mercy. If he died, it was his time, and the infirmarer's role was merely to prepare him. Yet even within this doctrine, monks still sought relief. They winced, cried, begged for aid. Reginald did not ignore this. He came to believe that his work was not a denial of God's will, but an extension of it. That caring for the body, however limited, was a kind of devotion. And so he bled a monk on Wednesday, fasted with him on Friday, and buried him on Sunday. This integration of body and soul was reflected in daily routines. Monks prayed over their food, their medicine, their fevers. They received the Eucharist alongside treatment. Their lives were not compartmentalized. Death as the final patient. One winter, a young monk named Brother Oswin fell ill with a wasting fever. Reginald tried everything: warm compresses, sage broth, bleeding by leech, hymns by candlelight. But the boy faded. On his final night, Oswin whispered, "Will it hurt?" Reginald replied, "Only for a moment, and then it will be lifted." Oswin died quietly, holding a carved wooden cross. Reginald noted the time in the infirmary record and folded his hands. He sat with the body until dawn. The next morning he cleaned the room, burned rue to cleanse the air, and prepared a barley soup for the remaining patients. To him, death was neither failure nor triumph. It was simply another form of care. The fragile authority of medical writing. Reginald's notes, like many monastic records, were not intended to influence the world beyond the cloister. He wrote for posterity, yes, but also for the next infirmarer. Each entry, a humble contribution to a living tradition. He knew that his understanding was limited. He did not question the theory of humors, nor the spiritual value of illness, but he questioned dosages. He revised methods. He wondered why Brother Anselm had recovered while Brother Ethelwold did not. This slow, internal questioning, recorded without flourish, was an early form of clinical observation. Not dramatic, not revolutionary, but it marked the slow pivot from theory toward practice. When the outside world entered, occasionally, a nobleman or bishop might visit the monastery infirmary seeking rest. In such cases, the infirmarer was expected to offer his best treatments: refined tonics, rare herbs, perhaps even a brief foot washing. These moments introduced outside scrutiny. Noble visitors brought their own expectations: urban physicians, dietary demands, political tensions. Reginald adapted as best he could, but he preferred his brothers: the coughing friar, the limping elder, the silent man who simply wanted to be left alone. So what happens when a vocation built on humility encounters growing knowledge? When ancient medical doctrine begins to crack under the pressure of new observation? And can a man whose entire life is ruled by ritual ever learn to trust a treatment that comes from doubt rather than doctrine? The scriptorium is quiet this morning. A warm sliver of sunlight cuts across the stone floor, catching the dust as it floats in the air. Brother Reginald, the infirmarer, finishes copying a final line into the vellum-bound register of deaths. Brother Edwin, aged 54, succumbed to swelling of the liver, received unction, buried with psalms. He closes the book gently. This is the end of our story within these stone walls, not marked by dramatic discoveries or heroic recoveries, but by a deeply human legacy of quiet work, careful observation, and ritualized care. Here in the monastery, healing was never flashy, never fast, and rarely definitive. But in many ways, the medieval monastic infirmary kept the fragile ember of medical continuity alive during centuries of social and political upheaval. This final section reflects on the long view. What did monasteries contribute to the development of medicine? What survives of their knowledge? And what quiet revolutions occurred behind cloistered walls, written not in bold ink, but in the slow script of habit. The hidden medical archive. The monastic infirmary may not have looked like a center of innovation, but in a time when war, plague, and famine burned through the fabric of Europe, monasteries were among the few places where books, gardens, and bodies coexisted in quiet continuity. Their contributions were subtle but vital. Preservation of classical medical texts. Galen, Hippocrates, and later Arabic scholars like Avicenna were copied meticulously. Translation. Monks played key roles in adapting works from Greek and Arabic into Latin. Local adaptation. They modified treatments based on local herbs, climates, and patterns of illness. Data collection. Infirmers kept death records, weather notes, and anecdotal observations rudimentary but foundational. Standardization. Some monasteries used consistent recipes, formulas, and seasonal routines that prefigured later pharmacology. All of this was done not out of scientific curiosity but out of spiritual duty, and yet it laid groundwork. The monastery became, in essence, a custodian of medical history. Quiet collaboration, the religious roots of rational care. One of the least recognized aspects of monastic medicine is its communal nature. Decisions were made in conversation with patients, with texts, with tradition. Brother Reginald never acted entirely alone. He consulted the abbot. He read aloud from the Physica of Hildegard of Bingen. He sought advice from traveling monks who had studied in other abbeys or cathedral schools. This slow, layered collaboration allowed for conservative improvement. Methods were not overturned, but nudged. A salve's base might shift from lard to beeswax. A treatment for coughing might swap horehound for hyssop after a particularly bad season. Reginald's notebook may have included entries like, Brother Matthew's stomach pained after coriander, replaced with fennel in next tonic. No complaint thereafter. These observations, unassuming as they seem, represent the earliest glimmers of empirical thinking, recording patterns, testing outcomes, adjusting practice. In this way, monastic infirmaries served as quiet laboratories, long before microscopes and germ theory. When crisis came, the plague years. Though Reginald himself would not live to see it, monastic infirmaries were eventually overwhelmed by the Black Death in the mid-14th century. The bubonic plague tore through monasteries with devastating speed. Communal living, shared meals, and constant contact with the sick made monks particularly vulnerable. Infirmaries, once places of healing and order, became overwhelmed. Records from the time describe monks dying faster than they could be buried. Entire abbeys emptied. Death came too swiftly for leeches, prayers, or boiled herbs to help. But even amidst collapse, the medical impulse persisted. Some monks continued to record symptoms. Others attempted new remedies, burning herbs, isolating patients, even wearing rudimentary face coverings. The plague shattered confidence in Galenic theory, but it also forced a reckoning. In a strange way, the devastation planted seeds of change. More attention was paid to observation, quarantine, and sanitation. Slowly, medieval medicine began to shift from sacred script to secular scrutiny. A tradition that lingered. Long after Brother Reginald's death, the monastic model of care persisted in other forms. Hospital orders like the Hospitallers and Augustinians built larger public hospitals, drawing on monastic infirmary practices. Apothecaries used monastic herbal recipes well into the 17th century. Medical schools in Salerno, Paris, and Bologna traced their textual roots to monastic libraries. Even today, some monastic gardens in Europe still grow medicinal herbs based on medieval planting charts. Reginald's methods, though quaint by today's standards, formed the soil in which modern medicine would eventually grow. The theology of healing. We cannot understand monastic medicine without addressing its spiritual underpinning. Illness was not just biological, it was moral, cosmic, communal. To suffer was to join in Christ's passion. To heal was to restore not just function, but order. Healing was less about erasing pain and more about accompanying it, bearing witness to it, transforming it into something sacred. This may seem foreign now, but it offered a coherent framework for care. Brother Reginald didn't need to know the pathogen behind a fever to know that sitting beside the sick, offering warm broth and a psalm, was meaningful work. And perhaps, in our own age of technological medicine, something of that ethos still holds value. A final note from the infirmarer's desk. Before his death, Reginald added a final entry to his personal notebook. It read, "Of all herbs, I find balm of Gilead most comforting, not for the body but for the heart. It cannot cure the cough, but it makes the sufferer feel remembered." His writing was small, tight, slightly smudged. It wasn't intended for fame. It was for the next infirmarer, a quiet gesture of continuity. He died shortly after, not of plague or fever, but of old age. His burial was modest. The apothecary jars were cleaned. The next brother took his place. And so the work continued through centuries, through silence, through the slow, deliberate turning of the page. Monastic medicine did not save the world. It did not revolutionize treatment, but it preserved knowledge, dignity, and the habit of care. So as you settle into sleep, consider this. In an age where healing is often rushed and transactional, what might we recover from a world where to tend a body was also to tend a soul? And what, after all, does it mean to heal, not just to cure? Story 3. The Black Death's Silent Apprentices, Graveyard Surgeons of 1348. It begins with silence, not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that descends after too many voices have been lost. The year is 1348. The Black Death has arrived in Europe. In cities and towns, the air is thick with the smell of decay. Bells toll constantly. Shops are shuttered, schools closed, and churches overwhelmed. No one knows what causes the illness. Some blame bad air. Others, God's wrath. A few whisper about invisible poisons in water or clothing. But as the bodies pile high in carts and the graveyards overflow, something shifts in the minds of a few. This story does not follow kings or physicians, but young men with bloodied aprons and trembling hands, apprentice grave diggers, chirurgeons in training, and would-be healers who found themselves face to face with human anatomy in its rawest, most horrifying form. These are the silent apprentices of the Black Death, uneducated, unsupervised, and yet deeply involved in the medical revolution to come. This section introduces a new kind of medieval figure, one whose story is often lost beneath the louder tales of saints and scholars. This is a story of trauma, of desperate learning, and of unexpected insight born in the shadow of mass death. The arrival of the plague. The first signs were quiet. A few travelers fell ill at a port in Genoa. Then came the swelling, blackened buboes in the groin and armpit, followed by vomiting, fever, and death within days. By the time authorities recognized the scope, it was far too late. The Black Death, likely a combination of bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague, spread with terrifying speed. By the end of the 1350s, it would kill an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Medical systems collapsed. Trained physicians fled or perished. Clerics, often charged with tending to the sick, died in such numbers that the church ran out of priests. Families abandoned each other. Entire villages vanished. And yet, amid this horror, opportunity strange and unsettling emerged. The apprentice without a master. In a city like Florence or Avignon, a young man, perhaps 15 or 16, might have been apprenticed to a barber surgeon. His duties were basic: sharpening blades, preparing leeches, cleaning tools, applying bandages. He wasn't trained in anatomy, nor expected to ask questions. But when his master died in the early wave of the plague, the apprentice was left alone. The bodies kept arriving. The need for anyone to cut, to clean, to dress wounds did not vanish. So, in the void of authority, the apprentice continued. Some began performing autopsies, though the word was not yet widely used. In secret, or under orders from desperate city councils, they opened corpses to search for the signs of death. They sliced into swollen lymph nodes, examined darkened lungs, and observed organs riddled with blackened fluid. It was grotesque but strangely compelling. What began as grave digging and corpse management gradually became something else, a primitive, unsupervised education in anatomy, a new access to the body. Prior to the plague, dissection was rare and heavily restricted. The church discouraged it, and many medical schools relied solely on classical texts, especially Galen, whose anatomical writings, based on animal dissection, were often inaccurate. But now bodies were everywhere, and with so few physicians left alive, local authorities became more permissive. They needed answers. Some cities like Bologna, Padua, and later Montpellier quietly sanctioned dissections not in grand lecture halls, but in hastily cleared rooms, guarded by clerks and watched by trembling assistants. These unofficial dissections often fell to apprentices, graveyard workers, and low-ranking surgeons, who lacked formal education but were rich in practical exposure. For the first time in centuries, the human body was no longer sacred in death. It became a subject of study, even if no one yet called it that. Observations from the margins. These early dissectors began noticing discrepancies between the textbook bodies of Galenic medicine and the corpses they examined. The liver was smaller than expected. The heart was not divided into clearly separated chambers. The mysterious reedy mirabile described by Galen, supposedly, a network of vessels at the base of the brain, was nowhere to be found. They lacked the authority to challenge ancient texts, but they knew what they saw. Some apprentices began keeping notes not in Latin but in vernacular language, short, practical observations. Found black water in chest of woman aged 30, smelled of vinegar, died in 3 days. No bile in stomach, blood thick and dark, boil near left ear. These notes were not philosophy. They were protodata, small, uncredited contributions to the slow reawakening of empirical medical practice. Trauma and desensitization. The toll of this work was immense. Many of these young men had no training to face death, let alone handle it so intimately. They suffered hallucinations, nightmares, and sometimes died themselves from exposure or infection. But they also became desensitized. By the 100th corpse, they stopped gagging. By the 1,000th, they worked with mechanical efficiency. Some grew numb, others grew obsessed. In a strange way, the Black Death created a generation of accidental anatomists, people who knew more about the human body than most university-trained doctors, simply because they had seen it fail so many times. Church sin and the body. There was no unified church doctrine on dissection at the time. While some clergy condemned it as a violation of the sacred vessel, others saw it as a necessary evil during a time of divine judgment. The plague blurred boundaries. Bodies were no longer buried with elaborate rites. Mass graves, known as plague pits, were dug with haste and often without clergy present. It became harder to speak of the body as holy when it lay piled among hundreds. And so the mysticism surrounding anatomy began to erode, slowly, not from argument or rebellion but from sheer necessity. The dead had to be handled. Someone had to learn. Notebooks without names. Of the notes and records from these silent apprentices, few remain. Most were destroyed, buried, or simply ignored. But a few odd manuscripts survive in European libraries unattributed, written in plain script, filled with curious anatomical sketches. These were not the polished illustrations of Renaissance anatomy. They were crude, a liver like a lump, a lung drawn like a sponge. But they show something radical, the body as it was, not as it had been imagined. The first cuts toward modern medicine. In the chaos of the Black Death, medical orthodoxy fractured. The silent apprentices did not set out to change the world. They sought survival, and yet their work, unsupervised, uncredited, and often unacknowledged, opened the door to a more physical, more visible, and eventually more scientific understanding of disease. Not all stories of progress begin in lecture halls. Some begin in graveyards under gray skis, with the sound of shovels and the quiet scrape of a knife across skin. What does it mean that the greatest anatomical awakening of the Middle Ages began not with scholars, but with gravediggers? And how many revolutions in knowledge have started in silence, buried beneath the weight of suffering? The streets of Avignon are quieter now. The great wave of plague has passed, but its echo lingers. The dead are buried in lime-lined trenches, their names, if ever known, long forgotten. In one corner of the city, behind the small chapel of St. Andrew, an apprentice named Martin sharpens a bone-handled blade and unfolds a piece of parchment. He is not a surgeon, not truly, but for the past year Martin has opened more bodies than most licensed doctors. He does not speak of this to the priests or the remaining physicians. He works at night when the city sleeps, his lantern flickering beside him. The bodies still come less now, but still. This section follows apprentices like Martin in the uncertain months after the initial devastation. When the worst had seemingly passed, many survivors, especially those who had witnessed the plague up close, were left with questions. Not spiritual questions, but bodily ones. What was the black swelling? Why did some die and others live? Where in the body did death take root? In monasteries, university towns, and city corners, a handful of brave, often untrained hands continued the dangerous work of dissection. In their crude sketches, unrefined tools, and trial-by-error observations, we begin to see the first stirrings of forensic medicine, anatomical precision, and something entirely new: learning from the dead. When dissection became necessary. Before the Black Death, dissection in Europe was largely ceremonial. In medical schools such as those in Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris, a physician would read aloud from Galen's texts, while a lower-ranked assistant, often a barber surgeon, performed the cuts on a cadaver, typically of a condemned criminal. But the plague broke down ceremony. There were no lecture halls, no professors, only bodies, apprentices who remained some orphans, others survivors were often left to handle corpses alone. They began with surface anatomy, not from theory, but from function. How deep does a blade have to go before someone bleeds out? What lies beneath the swelling of a plague bubo? What color is the liver in someone who died of fever? How do the lungs feel in a corpse that coughed blood for days? They learned by necessity, not by curriculum. Some worked under the vague direction of local councils or minor physicians. Others acted on their own, recording what they could, unsure whether it was legal or wise to do so. Rudimentary tools, practical outcomes. The tools were basic. Knives sharpened on whetstones. Hooks fashioned from iron or bone. Waxed linen to hold notes or specimens. Wooden boards for positioning bodies. There were no antiseptics, no gloves, and no formal protocols. Most dissections were done in haste. The smell was overwhelming. Lime or vinegar was sometimes used to suppress odor. Yet out of this crudity, insights emerged. For instance, a London apprentice named Thomas observed that the black water, likely internal bleeding, often filled the chest cavity before death. A scribe in Languedoc recorded that cutting into the groin of plague victims released thick, tar-like matter with no smell, and associated it with more rapid decline. In Avignon, a notary-turned-mortician noted that those with no visible buboes often died faster, leading him to speculate that the unseen infection of the lungs was deadlier than the swellings. None of these notes made it into academic publication, but they circulated hand to hand, city to city, and in time they seeded skepticism about long-held medical dogma. The crisis of Galen. Galen had been medicine's master for over a millennium. His writings, based on animal dissection, taught that blood passed through invisible pores in the heart. The liver was the source of all blood. Disease stemmed from imbalance in the four humors. The plague and the unsupervised work of apprentices challenged all of this. They saw blood pool in the lungs, not flow invisibly. They found tumors and abscesses where no ancient text had described them. They opened skulls and saw no reedy mirabile, no divine lattice of vessels, just brain, bone, fluid. Some apprentices began sketching what they saw. The drawings were poor in proportion but rich in honesty. One sketch, preserved anonymously in a Flemish manuscript, shows a cross-section of a torso with the liver, intestines, and spleen labeled in Old Dutch. Another, found folded inside a legal document in Venice, displays a bloated face, annotated with signs of sickness that spreads to the lungs. These were not diagrams for public display. They were private reckonings, an attempt to impose order on what had seemed like senseless death. The emergence of the chirurgeon. In the decades following the Black Death, the barber surgeon evolved. No longer merely a cutter of hair and puller of teeth, he became by necessity a man of wounds, bones, and flesh. And many of them had started their careers in 1348, apprenticed during the plague. The Chirurgia Magna, published by Guy de Chauliac, a physician who lived through the plague in Avignon, drew from surgical experience during the crisis. Though he was university trained, Guy acknowledged the limitations of academic medicine. He emphasized observation, manual skill, and the importance of knowing the body through contact, not just texts. His work directly influenced generations of surgical apprentices, many of whom came from humble backgrounds. Some, perhaps, were the very boys who had dissected plague victims in silence. Thus, the apprentice grave cutter became, over time, a respected practitioner not overnight, but through decades of accumulated trust, grit, and learning by doing. The ethical gray area. Of course, not all society welcomed this change. Many still viewed dissection as sacrilegious. In some cities, apprentices were beaten or exiled for opening corpses without permission. Some were accused of witchcraft, others simply vanished. Yet public health began to offer a counterweight to fear. In cities like Milan and Venice, authorities began to sanction autopsies in the name of learning. Slowly, the idea that the dead might teach the living became acceptable, even necessary. This shift would eventually lead to the formalization of anatomy in medical schools. But it began here, in the unrecorded hands of plague-era workers, whose names were never written but whose eyes had seen what most feared to face. What they learned from death. Perhaps most importantly, these apprentices came to understand that disease was not a moral failing, nor always visible from the outside. They learned to differentiate between symptoms and causes, connect internal decay with outward signs, recognize the limitations of spiritual interpretation alone. Their language was not scientific, but their impulse was. In their own way, they were the first to truly look at the body as material, not mystical. So as these apprentices scribbled their notes on scraps of linen and margins of prayer books, one wonders, did they realize they were planting the roots of modern anatomy? Or were they simply trying to understand why the world had changed, why death had come, and what it had left behind inside the human frame? The year is 1351. The worst of the Black Death has passed, but the landscape it leaves behind is irreversibly altered. The air still holds the memory of burning herbs and the scent of mass graves. Fields lie fallow. Cities mourn their dead. Yet amidst the ruin, something new begins to stir, an awakening not born of triumph, but of survival. This final section explores the aftermath of the plague's devastation, when the knowledge forged in crisis began to crystallize into formal change. The silent apprentices, those nameless young men who handled the bodies, recorded symptoms, and dared to open the dead, would not all live to see the transformations they helped initiate. But their impact, though quiet and often unattributed, was foundational. This is the story of how gravediggers became healers, how unorthodox knowledge challenged centuries of tradition, and how catastrophe carved open the body not just in flesh, but in thought. The knowledge that remained. In cities like Florence, Siena, and Paris, the plague had upended medical hierarchy. University-trained physicians had either died or fled, their absence creating space for a new kind of practitioner, one grounded not in books alone, but in bodies. The survivors among the apprentices and barber surgeons began writing more. Their observations, once scrawled in margins, were now copied more carefully. Some were collected into practical manuals, often titled Books of Secrets, which detailed procedures for lancing buboes, cleaning infected wounds, preparing herbal salves, identifying signs of death versus unconsciousness. These manuals were unofficial, written in vernacular languages and rarely respected by academic authorities, but they were used, shared, adapted, expanded. In time, their observations would influence scholars who survived the plague, including Mondino de Luzzi, who helped formalize human dissection in Bologna, and Guy de Chauliac, who chronicled the plague while surviving it himself. The work of the silent apprentices did not die with them. It seeped upward, first through hands, then through words. Formalizing the body, the rise of anatomical study. Before 1348, human dissection was rare, symbolic, and largely ritualized. After the Black Death, that began to change slowly but significantly. By the late 14th century, medical faculties in Bologna, Padua, and Montpellier were conducting regular dissections, sometimes twice a year. Dissection was no longer reserved for criminals. Cities now permitted anonymous plague victims to be examined post-mortem. A division of labor emerged. The lecturer would read from Galen, the ostensor would point to body parts, and the sector, often a barber surgeon or former apprentice, would perform the cuts. This evolution was directly linked to the earlier period of unsupervised anatomical work during the plague, when practical necessity had forced lower-ranking practitioners to handle cadavers in the absence of formal medicine. The unspoken lesson of the plague years: direct observation had value, even when it contradicted received wisdom. Challenges to Galenic authority. In 1348, Galen's teachings were still gospel, but by 1400, a growing number of practitioners had begun to doubt the texts, not from rebellion, but from discrepancy. The heart did not have invisible pores. The liver was not the seat of all blood production. Organs were not arranged as the ancients had described. These contradictions emerged not from philosophy, but from practice, from the hundreds of apprentices who had opened bodies, noted their features, and buried them quietly. It would still take another century for Galen's dominance to be seriously overturned, most famously by Andreas Vesalius in 1543. But the groundwork had been laid in the chaotic dissection rooms of plague-era Europe. From corpse handling to surgery. As public trust in academic physicians waned after the plague, surgical practitioners rose in status. Many had begun as barbers, mortuary workers, or hospital assistants. By the 15th century, cities like Paris and London saw the rise of surgical guilds, formal organizations that trained and regulated these formerly marginal workers. Their curriculum included basic anatomy, wound care, amputation and cauterization, bone setting, treatment of ulcers and boils. Some of the earliest surgical manuals were based not on Galen, but on case records compiled by plague-era healers. These practical guides focused on what to do, not why it worked. Thus, the crisis-born knowledge of 1348 began its slow march toward clinical standardization. Ethical and spiritual shifts. The sheer volume of death during the plague had a democratizing effect. Bodies, once considered sacred and untouchable, had become accessible not disrespectfully, but out of collective desperation. This shift prompted a theological reconsideration. If touching and examining the body could prevent more death, was it not a moral good? By the early 1400s, even some church officials began to sanction dissection for learning, so long as it was conducted with dignity. This subtle realignment of spiritual and anatomical values paved the way for later acceptance of public anatomy theaters and the broader integration of dissection into medical education. What was lost in what was found? It is important to remember that most apprentices did not survive. Many were poor, malnourished, and overexposed to disease. Their names were not recorded. Their drawings, if they made them, were lost. Their insights, if whispered, were forgotten. But what they left behind was not nothing. They left behind a new willingness to learn from the dead, a practical approach to anatomy, a quiet rebellion against untouchable knowledge, a generation of future surgeons, emboldened by necessity. Their contribution was not a revolution. It was a correction, a shift from abstract theory toward visible truth. A final image, the apprentice's desk. Imagine, if you can, a narrow table in a stone room, a tallow candle guttering at its edge, a page of parchment covered in ink smudges, drawn in crude charcoal, the outline of a ribcage half erased. Below it, a line written in uneven Latin. Vidi in mort quod liber non dixit. I saw in death what the book did not say. That apprentice may never be named, but his hand and hands like his guided us gently, bloodily, unknowingly toward the world we now inhabit. So as you drift into sleep, remember this. It was not always kings, scholars, or saints who moved history. Sometimes it was the boy with the knife, the scribe with the ink, the gravedigger with a question. And sometimes, the greatest learning begins in silence between the turning of a page and the lifting of a blade. Story 4. Salt, Sweat, and Wounds. Battlefield Medicine in the 100 Years' War. It is 1360. A narrow path snakes between muddy fields in Gascony. Rain falls in a steady rhythm, soaking the earth and making every step a burden. The smell of damp wool, sweat, and iron fills the air. Around you are soldiers, some French, some English, most mercenaries. They march toward yet another skirmish in a war that has no clear end. This is not the story of kings or castles, but of a foot soldier whose leg has been sliced open and now festers beneath a crust of dried blood and straw. Welcome to the medical world of the battlefield, where treatment is improvisation, and survival is mostly a matter of chance, timing, and the resilience of the human body. This section immerses us in the lived, grim reality of medieval field medicine during the 100 Years' War, an era where wounds were common, infection rampant, and understanding of the human body remained deeply flawed. Still, amid the chaos of arrows, swords, and disease, people tried to heal, to stitch, to save. A war without end. The 100 Years' War 1337–1453 was not a single, continuous conflict, but a series of campaigns, truces, and skirmishes between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France. It spanned generations, from Edward III to Henry VI, Charles V to Charles VII. For common soldiers, war was not about dynastic claims or national identity. It was a way of life and a source of injury, disease, and sometimes employment. Many were poor men, pressed into service or hired by roving lords. Few received pay on time. Fewer still received proper care when wounded. The reality of the wounded. A battlefield injury was more than pain, it was a crisis. An arrow lodged in the thigh, a sword slash across the forearm, a crushed foot beneath a horse, all common wounds, all potentially fatal. There were no triage systems, no dedicated medics. If you fell, your survival depended on whether your comrades could carry you, whether there was shelter nearby, whether a surgeon was available or sober, whether your wound bled cleanly or turned black. Most soldiers carried basic remedies: a cloth soaked in wine or vinegar, perhaps a pouch of herbs, maybe a prayer charm stitched into their tunic. But in truth, once wounded, a man's best hope was to find a camp surgeon and hope he wasn't drunk or dead. The barber surgeon in the camp. Enter the barber surgeon. He did not wear white robes. He likely smelled of sweat and cloves. His tools were basic: a sharp knife or scalpel, bone saws, forceps or tongs for arrow removal, hot irons for cauterization, linen strips for bandaging, wine, vinegar, or brine as antiseptics, though they did not use that word. He was not trained in anatomy. He learned by doing. Often, he was hired by a nobleman to treat his retinue, but many treated commoners too, either for coin or duty. One such man, Jean de Lanville, left behind a letter describing his experience during the siege of Poitiers. The wound was through the thigh. I found the arrow shaft buried to the bone. I cut around it with my blade, burned the area with a heated iron, and packed it with wool soaked in vinegar. The man screamed, but he lived. I bled him 3 days later to draw out bad humors. His method was brutal, but not ineffective. Wounds cleaned with wine or vinegar had a better chance of healing, even if the patient passed out during the process. The role of salt, brine, and vinegar. Lacking modern antiseptics, medieval battlefield medics turned to what they knew preserved food: salt and vinegar. Salt was rubbed into wounds or mixed with fat to form a salve. Vinegar was used to wash deep cuts and arrow sites. Wine was sometimes preferred, especially if it was strong and aged. These treatments worked not because the surgeons understood bacteria, but because salt and acidic solutions inhibit microbial growth. There are records of battlefield physicians boiling water and wine to clean instruments, a practice possibly adopted from Arabic medical texts, or simply invented through repetition and luck. Still, infection remained common. Wounds turned black, flesh rotted. Surgeons learned to spot gangrene and tetanus. They called them the death rot and the locked mouth. Amputation, a choice of timing. If a wound festered beyond saving, amputation was often the only hope. The tools were crude. The procedure was swift. A tourniquet was tied, sometimes just a twisted strip of leather. The limb was cut quickly with a saw. The stump was cauterized with a hot iron to stop bleeding. The patient might be held down by fellow soldiers or given wine to dull pain. There was no anesthesia. Mortality was high, especially from shock, but some did survive and continued to fight, limp, or serve in other ways. One famous record from 1415 describes a soldier who lost his foot at Agincourt, recovered, and was later employed as a cook's assistant in an English garrison. Field hospitals and makeshift care. During longer sieges, armies sometimes constructed makeshift hospitals, usually tents or wooden huts, staffed by monks, surgeons, or hired caretakers. Conditions were miserable. Bloodied linens reused. Flies swarming open wounds. Stench of excrement and infection. Groans of the dying mixed with prayer. Still, basic order was maintained. Wounds were cleaned. Poultices were applied: comfrey, mallow, and clay mixed with honey or lard. Bandages were changed. Broth was given. Patients were bled. These hospitals were not restorative. They were places of stabilization or, at worst, deathbeds. What did a wounded man hope for? He hoped the bleeding would stop, that the swelling would go down, that he would not fall asleep and wake to find his leg gone. He hoped to be seen, to be touched with care, even by rough hands. He likely prayed not always to live, but to die quickly if he must. Those who recovered bore scars and stories. A healed wound might grant a kind of status proof of survival. Some even saw their scars as blessings, a mark of divine favor. The lessons of the front line. For all its horrors, the battlefield was an accelerator of medical pragmatism. It forced improvisation. It trained surgeons by fire. It created a crude but vital chain of care between soldier and healer. And as the 100 years, war dragged on, the experience accumulated. Which herbs helped swelling? How to spot septic rot early? When to amputate? Which poultices soothed burns? When to bleed and when not to? These lessons, passed orally, rarely made it into books, but they were remembered by those who lived through them and taught to the next boy sharpening knives by firelight. So one wonders, what knowledge was gained by the wounded, the weary, and the anonymous men who cleaned wounds with brine and hoped for dawn? And how many lives were saved not by brilliance but by persistence, patience, and pain? The sun is low over the battlefield. A haze of smoke hangs in the air, mixing with the stink of blood and sweat. Shouts echo across the torn countryside, orders, prayers, cries for help. In a small clearing behind a hastily erected canvas tent, a surgeon squats over a young archer. The boy's arm dangles by a ribbon of flesh. His face is pale. He's not screaming anymore. The surgeon dips his hands in wine, not to clean them, he doesn't know that word, but to prepare for pain. The knife is already in the fire, the saw nearby. This is not the place for theory. This is the world of field surgery during the 100 Years' War, where every cut is a gamble and every breath a possible last. In this section, we examine the tools, techniques, and decision-making of battlefield surgeons. Neither butchers nor scientists, these men operated in a gray zone of necessity where improvisation was key, and even the most basic procedure could decide a soldier's fate. The surgeon's tools. A medieval field surgeon's kit was small but deadly effective. Contained in a cloth roll or wooden box, it included scalpels and knives, often reused, cleaned with brine, vinegar, or simply wiped. Bone saw used for amputations. Straight and serrated, its edge dulled quickly. Forceps for removing arrowheads, splinters, and foreign matter. Hooks and retractors, primitive but useful in holding wounds open for cleaning. Cautery irons, heated in fire and pressed to wounds to stop bleeding. Needles and thread, usually linen or silk for stitching deep cuts. Sponges and cloths for swabbing blood, rarely sterilized. Basic herbs, dried yarrow, comfrey, mallow, and rosemary, sometimes garlic or honey. The tools were unadorned. The skill lay not in elegance but in speed, pressure, and the ability to keep the patient from thrashing. Arrow wounds and battlefield priorities. Arrows were a common cause of injury. During battles like Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, archers played a central role, unleashing thousands of projectiles in waves. An arrow wound posed several dangers. Deep penetration, some lodged in the chest or belly. Barbed heads, removed improperly, they tore more flesh. Infection, dirt and cloth often entered with the arrow. Surgeons had various techniques for removing arrows. Push through. If the arrow had passed deep, they would extend the wound and push it out the opposite side. Forceps or tongs, gripping the shaft and pulling slowly, often while twisting. Dilating the wound, cutting around the site to avoid tearing tissue. Surgeons used wine or vinegar to clean the site. If bleeding continued, they applied pressure or cautery. No stitches were placed until infection risk lessened if the soldier survived that long. Burns, blunt trauma, and sword gashes. Beyond arrows, soldiers suffered. Burns from torches, boiling oil, or fire. Blunt trauma, mace and club strikes shattered bones without breaking skin. Slicing wounds, swords and axes left gaping cuts. Burns were treated with cool compresses if available, followed by ointments, often honey, goose fat, or herbal salves. Some surgeons used clay or ashes to draw out heat. Blunt injuries posed greater diagnostic challenges. Without X-rays or anatomy knowledge, surgeons judged broken bones by sight and touch. Setting bones involved manual manipulation, and splints often wooden sticks tied with strips of cloth. Sword wounds were cleaned and compressed. If deep, they were packed with cloth soaked in wine and left partially open to drain the evil humors. Closure was delayed, if attempted at all. Pain management, crude but considered. Pain was inevitable, but surgeons did what they could. Strong wine or ale, offered before procedures. Opium poppy, rare and expensive, sometimes made into a syrup. Henbane and mandrake, used in sleeping potions, though dangerous. Willow bark or meadowsweet, mild analgesics precursors to aspirin. Distraction or restraint, a fellow soldier might hold the patient still. Despite the brutality, some surgeons were gentle by necessity. They knew that a calmer patient was easier to treat and more likely to survive. Infection, gangrene, and amputation. Infection set in quickly. Surgeons observed the signs. Skin around the wound turning black or green. Foul odor. Swelling and heat. Muscle stiffness. When a limb showed signs of gangrene, amputation became the only option. Timing was crucial. If done too late, the infection spread. Too early, and the patient might die of shock or blood loss. Most amputations occurred within a day or two of injury if the soldier survived that long. Amputation was fast under 2 minutes in skilled hands. A tourniquet above the joint, a saw below. Blood loss was managed with hot irons and binding cloths. Recovery was uncertain. Some healed. Others succumbed to secondary infection, blood poisoning, or unseen internal damage. Surgeons and social status. Surgeons occupied an odd space. They were essential, yet often viewed as lesser than physicians, who studied books rather than wounds. Still on the battlefield, the barber surgeon's experience trumped theory. Commanders relied on them. Wounded knights trusted them. Their survival rate, even if poor, was better than nothing. Some became renowned. Jean de Villiers, a French surgeon in the late 14th century, wrote detailed accounts of treating battle wounds. Others trained apprentices, passing on techniques refined not in universities, but in mud, sweat, and blood. The camp hospital, suffering in stillness. Sieges offered time to build rudimentary hospitals, long tents, or abandoned buildings near the battlefield. Here, the wounded were brought, sorted, and treated. Latrines were dug nearby, but hygiene was poor. Beds were straw on the ground. Care was often administered by monks, wives of soldiers, or even prostitutes turned nurses. Nutrition was key: bone broth, onions, and warm water. Patients were bled frequently, in keeping with humor theory. Fevered men were shaved, given cooling herbs, and kept in the shade. There was little hope for those with internal injuries. Death came quietly or violently if infection took hold. Prayers were whispered over the dying. The living turned their faces away. What was learned? Despite all limitations, battlefield surgeons learned through necessity. Clean wounds fared better than closed ones. Boiled tools reduced infection. Some herbs calmed pain or reduced swelling. Surgery required not knowledge alone, but nerve and speed. Many of these lessons would echo into the Renaissance, eventually influencing formal surgery and military medicine. They came not from books, but from blood. In the face of chaos, what endures? Not always knowledge in ink, but experience in hands. And how many lives were quietly preserved in a world where survival itself was the greatest triumph? The battle is over. The horses are dead or gone. The banners lie torn in the mud. The survivors are limping back to their camps, leaning on each other, moaning under their breath. One soldier presses a bandaged stump to his chest. Another has had an arrow pulled from his belly. They have no victory speech, No glory, only pain and the faint hope of living long enough to see another meal. This final section of Story 4 shifts focus from the battlefield to the long, uncertain road of recovery. For those who did not die of their wounds, infection, or fever in the days immediately following combat, life afterward posed its own challenges. Rehabilitation, reintegration, and remembrance were rarely guaranteed. Still, across the war-torn landscape of the 100 Years' War, resilience bloomed in the cracks. We explore what happened after the wounds, how soldiers healed, what forms of care they received, if any, and how the physical and psychological trauma of war shaped the evolution of medieval medicine and attitudes toward the body. The healing process, time, herbs, and improvisation. For the wounded who made it off the battlefield alive, the process of healing was slow, imprecise, and uncertain. Recovery hinged on three things: clean wound management, minimal infection, access to nourishment and rest. There were no antibiotics, no physical therapy, but some made it through. Healing involved daily dressing changes, using cloths soaked in wine or vinegar. Application of poultices, comfrey nicknamed bone net, clay mixed with honey, garlic-infused oils. Warmth and shelter, critical for preventing exposure-induced death. Basic nutrition, warm broth, barley porridge, soft fruits if available. Rest, though rarely uninterrupted. Pain persisted, scars hardened, bones healed crooked, but if the wound didn't fester, if the fever stayed low, survival was possible. Some even returned to service. Crutches, stumps, and the return to life. Soldiers who lost limbs were not always discarded. Crude crutches, wooden pegs, or makeshift limb supports were fashioned from battlefield debris or crafted by local carpenters. Leather straps, iron braces, and tightly wound cloth provided rudimentary prosthetics. Few could return to fighting, but some found new roles. Camp cooks, watch guards, stable assistants, messengers. Others became beggars, especially in cities like Paris and London, where a missing limb or mutilated face told a story of sacrifice. Some towns offered small pensions, though this was rare and often tied to noble service. Religious institutions, especially those attached to monastic orders, occasionally offered convalescence. Some wounded men entered religious life not from faith, but from lack of options. Psychological trauma, the wounds unseen. Medieval records say little of what we now call psychological trauma, but it was there in silence, in superstition, in sudden outbursts of violence or weeping. Some soldiers refused to sleep indoors after surviving sieges. Others carried religious relics obsessively. Some returned to battlefields after wars ended, searching for bones of comrades. These are the behaviors of men trying to make sense of horror, long before the language of trauma existed. We find echoes in poems, in letters home. I see them in dreams, the boys with no mouths, their eyes full of birds. Such phrases suggest an inner landscape scarred as deeply as any body. Surgeons could not treat this. Monks might offer prayer, but most simply endured it, hardened by it, or broken by it. The emergence of practical medical knowledge. Despite the cost, the 100 Years' War produced a generation of seasoned healers. Surgeons who had operated under pressure now returned home with experience unmatched by university-trained doctors. Many opened urban practices. A few taught apprentices. A handful even contributed to the early surgical manuscripts that became cornerstones of Renaissance medicine. Their battlefield knowledge led to improved wound care, greater caution around closing wounds prematurely, better tools for arrow extraction, earlier recognition of gangrene, a growing understanding of triage, though it would not be called that yet. One anonymous text from the early 15th century reads, "Close no wound that steams with heat. Let it drain. Let it cool. Apply the herb of lion's comfrey with boiled wine and linen. Stitch only when the stink has fled. This is not poetry, it's progress. Shifting attitudes toward the body. Before the war, the human body was sacred, mysterious, and often inaccessible. By the war's end, it had become something else, a site of intervention, a thing that could be opened, closed, drained, braced, and survived. This shift would fuel a slow legitimization of surgery, the formation of surgical guilds, the professionalization of wound care specialists, the codification of battlefield medicine. War did not create modern medicine, but it accelerated its necessity. It made the body legible in new ways. Memorialization, the scar as story. In some villages, wounded veterans became living memory. Their scars were evidence, their survival a tale worth telling. Some told stories at market stalls. Others were hired to train young men. Knights might have their wounds written into heraldic poems. Commoners, if literate, wrote about what it felt like to be sewn back together. We have one letter from a Burgundian foot soldier named Pierre, written in 1429. The saw was sharp. They gave me a skin of wine and bit of leather to bite. I lived, though I walk like a broken cart. My mother kissed my hand when I returned. It was the only part not wounded. There is pain in that sentence, but also pride and dignity. The final reflection, what endures? As the 100 years, war faded into history, the practices of battlefield medicine echoed quietly through Europe. Army field hospitals, dedicated military surgeons, wound manuals and illustrated texts, the normalization of practical anatomy in medical training. None of this would have seemed revolutionary to the men on the ground. They only wanted to survive. And yet from their suffering came a body of knowledge not perfect, but tangible, carried not in books alone, but in hands, in tools, in scars. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, consider this. History remembers the kings and treaties, but medicine, the kind that touches skin and eases pain, often begins with men who carry no banners. And how many of our modern comforts were earned by someone who once lay in the mud, bleeding, whispering a prayer to live just one more day. Story 5. The Physician's Conundrum, Astrology, Urine, and Authority. The room smells faintly of rosemary and old parchment. Light streams through the narrow window of a study in Paris. A physician, Dr. Jacques de Vienne, leans over a ceramic flask of pale yellow liquid. He swirls it, then holds it up to a chart. Above the desk hangs a celestial diagram of the zodiac. Behind him, shelves are crowded with books bound in leather, copied by hand, lined with annotations in Latin. The year is 1372. The patient waits outside. This is the world of the university-trained physician, where urine speaks louder than pain, and the alignment of Mars might outweigh a patient's fever. In this world, medicine is both ritual and reputation, where healing is entangled with astrology, doctrine, and deference to ancient authorities. In this section, we'll explore the tools, thought processes, and limitations of the medieval learned physician, not the battlefield surgeon, but the man of letters, of degrees, and of charts. This is a story of medicine bound tightly to books and stars, and the tensions that arose when theory met the messy reality of human suffering. The physician's status and training. To be a physician in 14th century Europe was to belong to an elite class of healers. Trained at universities like Salerno, Bologna, Paris, and Montpellier, physicians studied Latin medical texts, Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and Rhazes al-Razi. Natural philosophy, Aristotle's theories of nature and balance. Astrology, especially Ptolemaic and Arabic influences. Humoral theory, the foundation of diagnosis and treatment. Physicians did not cut bodies or treat wounds. That was left to surgeons and barber surgeons. Instead, physicians diagnosed from a distance through conversation, observation, urine analysis, and astrological charts. Their robes were long, their pens were busy, their hands often remained clean. The theory of humors. All diagnoses began with the four humors. Blood hot and wet, linked to air and spring. Phlegm cold and wet, linked to water and winter. Yellow bile hot and dry, linked to fire and summer. Black bile cold and dry, linked to earth and autumn. Health meant balance, illness meant imbalance. A physician would assess the patient's complexion, their temperament, the season, the location, their diet and lifestyle, and crucially, their urine. From these clues, he would prescribe corrections, dietary changes, bloodletting, purging, or herbal concoctions. The practice of uroscopy. The urine flask, globular, clear, with a rounded base, was the centerpiece of diagnosis. Physicians carried diagrams showing 20 or more shades of yellow, brown, red, and green, each corresponding to different imbalances. The process. The patient provides a morning urine sample. The physician examines it in sunlight. He observes color, clarity, sediment, smell, bubbles. He compares it to a chart and determines the dominant humor or organ in distress. Urine was considered a mirror of the body's interior, especially when physical examination was taboo or impractical. Palpating the stomach or listening to the heart would have been seen as invasive, if not inappropriate. One Parisian physician wrote, "The eye is wiser than the hand. He who sees the urine knows the disease." In practice, however, it was far from perfect. Many diseases shared the same signs, but the ritual observing, interpreting, declaring was part of a theatrical performance of knowledge. Astrology, medicine by the heavens. Astrology was not a fringe belief, it was embedded in medicine. Physicians consulted planetary alignments to determine the best time to administer treatment, when to bleed a patient, whether recovery was likely, when a child's illness was most dangerous. They worked with zodiac charts, ephemerides, astronomical tables, and complex diagrams matching organs to zodiac signs. Aries head, Taurus neck, Gemini arms, Cancer chest, Leo heart, Virgo abdomen, Libra kidneys, Scorpio genitals, Sagittarius thigh, Capricorn knees, Aquarius legs, Pisces feet. If a patient had a cough and Saturn was in Cancer, treatment might be delayed or modified. Some physicians insisted on drawing the patient's natal chart before proceeding with any treatment. Others cast horoscopes during crises, believing celestial forces influence the body's susceptibility to certain ailments. Conflict between book and body. In theory, the physician's diagnosis was authoritative. In practice, it was often disconnected from reality. A man coughing blood in the cold might be diagnosed with a phlegmatic imbalance even if he had tuberculosis. A woman with stomach pains might be labeled melancholic or wandering womb. Treatments followed suit. Bloodletting for excess heat. Dietary restrictions. Bland food, certain fruits or meats. Herbal decoctions, chosen based on humoral attributes. Rest, prayer, or pilgrimages. But what if the patient got worse? The physician could always blame the stars, the patient's sins, corrupted air or miasmas, or the work of hidden humors. This created a safe feedback loop, where failure rarely implicated the physician's methods. Competition from other healers. Despite their prestige, university physicians were not the only healers in town. They competed with barber surgeons, practical men who treated wounds, performed bloodletting, and pulled teeth. Midwives, attending births and treating women's ailments. Herbalists and wise women, offering folk remedies, often drawn from generations of experience. Monastic infirmers, blending theology with herb lore. Charismatic healers or saints, those who claimed miraculous cures. Many commoners distrusted university physicians, especially since their fees were high and their remedies often slow. A woman might see a barber for her child's fever, a monk for her husband's weakness, and only seek a physician when all else failed. When physicians failed, one Parisian chronicle from 1373 tells of a physician who treated a nobleman's son with repeated purging and bloodletting. The boy died. The family, enraged, refused to pay. The physician left the city. Such stories were rare but telling. Failure tarnished authority. In cities where competition was fierce, physicians guarded their reputations fiercely. Some resorted to secret remedies, jealously protected. Others accused rivals of malpractice or quackery. Medical guilds and faculty charters attempted to standardize practice, but the gap between theory and effectiveness remained wide. The question of authority. By the end of the 14th century, a tension was rising. Should healing rely solely on ancient texts and astrology? Or should it include hands-on observation, practical experience, and even dissection? Some physicians began to quietly question their methods. They noticed that wounds healed without celestial guidance, that some herbs worked regardless of humoral theory, that urine, though ritualized, was not always truthful. These doubts would ferment over the next century, leading to the early stirrings of empirical medicine. But in 1372, Dr. Jacques still trusts his flask and his star chart. He prescribes a diet of cold vegetables, a bloodletting under the waning moon, and prayer at St. Denis's shrine. He nods with confidence. The patient thanks him, unaware that her true illness lies far beyond the stars. What happens when belief holds more power than evidence? And how long can a system survive when its success depends more on performance than outcome? The wooden bench is hard beneath her. A peasant woman, perhaps 40, waits outside the physician's chambers with her daughter who clutches at her belly. The girl is pale, fevered. The physician inside is arranging star charts. She is unsure whether this will help, but the priest said to see him. The apothecary refused her without a prescription. The midwife had done all she could. For most medieval people, interacting with a university-trained physician was a mixture of reverence and confusion. Physicians were educated, authoritative, and distant, yet they were also expensive, and their methods mysterious. Patients endured long waits, impersonal consultations, and treatments that were as much ritual as remedy. This section focuses on the experience of the patient, exploring what it meant to be diagnosed through urine and astrology, how trust in physicians was earned or lost, and how people navigated the uneasy space between faith, experience, and desperation. The ritual of the consultation. A consultation with a learned physician was rarely hands-on. Physical examination was limited or absent. Modesty, especially for women, took precedence. Diagnosis was structured and hierarchical. Initial interview, questions about symptoms, diet, mood, sleep, bowel movements, dreams. Uroscopy, analysis of urine brought in a sealed flask. Astrological interpretation, the casting of a chart if the case seemed complicated or urgent. Prescription, usually dietary advice, herbal remedies or purgatives. Letter to the apothecary, for preparation of compounds. Payment made in coin, kind, or sometimes delayed until outcome. The patient rarely understood the full logic behind the treatment. It was trust in the system and the social pressure of obeying an educated man that maintained the physician's position. The limits of the physician's reach. Physicians mostly served urban elites, merchants, nobles, clergy. In rural areas, their presence was rare. When they did travel outside the city, it was often for high-paying private cases. Most of the population, peasants, artisans, and the poor, relied on barber surgeons for physical ailments, herbalists and wise women for remedies. midwives for childbirth and gynecological care, monks or friars for spiritual and moral causes of illness. When people did see physicians, it was often a last resort. For children, at the insistence of clergy or landlords, out of desperation when other remedies failed. The cultural gap was wide. A woman who believed in evil eye or wind spirits might find little comfort in Galenic theory. A man used to poultices might balk at bloodletting based on Mars and Aries. Female patience and modesty. Women posed particular challenges for physicians. Modesty norms were strict. Direct examination of genital or breast-related symptoms was frowned upon, often avoided altogether. Instead, women described their symptoms to a male relative who relayed the information. Physicians prescribed based on generalized knowledge of female humors, often thought to be cold and moist. Urine was key, as it provided a neutral, impersonal insight. In difficult cases, midwives or matrons were consulted informally. This reliance on indirect knowledge meant many female ailments miscarriage, prolapse, menstrual disorders were misunderstood or misdiagnosed. Yet, some women also manipulated the system. They might substitute someone else's urine, or they might downplay symptoms to avoid invasive questions or blame. The role of language and literacy. Most patients were illiterate. Physicians spoke and wrote in Latin, the language of the university. Prescriptions, notes, and correspondence were inaccessible to the average person. This language barrier created distance but also aura. Latin conveyed authority. Patients rarely questioned it, even if they didn't understand it. Still, the inability to verify or challenge a diagnosis meant patients often turned to other sources for confirmation. Comparing symptoms with neighbors, asking local healers for second opinions, consulting dream books or religious texts, seeking pilgrimage or holy water just in case. In this way, the physician's word was not final. It existed alongside a constellation of competing interpretations. Healing as performance. Physicians often relied on ritual and appearance to inspire confidence. Their presence, garments, and procedures were meant to project certainty. A successful diagnosis involved dramatic inspection of the urine, reference to planetary alignments, precise, confident language, detailed written instructions, even if unreadable to the patient, controlled gestures and posture. This was part theater, part medicine. One French chronicler mocked a local physician who spoke more to the moon than to his patients. But others described patients leaving with hearts calmed by the doctor's confidence even if the remedy failed. Successes and failures. Not all university medicine was empty ritual. Many physicians did help. Advising proper diet and rest. Recommending herbs with real pharmacological effects, willow bark, sage, fennel. Diagnosing illnesses where others could not. Offering structure and care during crises. But failure was common. A man treated with repeated bloodletting might weaken fatally. A child purged with harsh laxatives could die of dehydration. A woman denied midwife care due to physician arrogance might lose her child. These failures fueled resentment, stories circulated, trust eroded. Navigating authority. Patients, especially in cities, became shrewd navigators of medical options. They mixed systems. A feverish boy might be bled by a barber, washed with holy water, fed broth by a neighbor, taken to a physician on the third day, offered to a saint's shrine if all else failed. The physician was not the first stop. He was one piece of a broader healing strategy, respected, but not absolute. This flexibility saved lives, and sometimes undermined the physician's claim to singular expertise. Seeds of doubt. By the late 14th century, some physicians began to feel the pressure. Pamphlets appeared questioning reliance on astrology. A few medical writers emphasized personal observation over tradition. One Parisian text reads, "The urine lies, the stars deceive, but the pulse speaks plain." This was the beginning of something new, a critical stance toward inherited knowledge. Slowly, some physicians began testing what they had previously taken on faith. The patient, always at the center, was both the reason for this shift and the measure of its failure. So what did it mean to be a patient when diagnosis was governed by planets, color wheels, and ancient charts? And when does trust, so carefully built through robes and rituals, begin to crack under the weight of its own uncertainty? It is the winter of 1394. A physician stands alone in his study, candlelight flickering over his astrological diagrams. Outside, Paris groans under the weight of plague once more. The stars above, once thought to reveal divine order, seem mute. The urine flasks on his shelf catch the candlelight, cloudy with sediment, uncertain like everything else. In this final section of Story 5, we explore the gradual unraveling of the intellectual foundations that supported the medieval physician's world. Astrology, uroscopy, and strict Galenic doctrine would not vanish overnight, but their authority was beginning to waver. New ideas, new observations, and above all, new expectations from patients and practitioners alike would force change. This is the story of a medical order beginning to question itself, though it did not yet know how to replace what it had always believed. Signs of doubt among the faithful. Some of the first fissures came from within. Not all physicians remained blindly loyal to the methods taught at Paris, Bologna, or Montpellier. Quietly, cautiously, a few began to ask difficult questions. Why do patients with the same humor imbalance die differently? Why do similar urine samples lead to opposite outcomes? Why does Mars in Pisces sometimes matter and sometimes not? In a 1398 commentary from a Montpellier-trained physician, we read, "The stars may incline, but they do not bind. I have bled men under Venus and they have died. I have treated women with no chart and they have lived." Such thoughts were not heresy, but they were dangerous. They implied that experience might be more trustworthy than ancient texts, that observation might matter more than inheritance. The rise of empirical practice. In the wake of the Black Death and its recurring outbreaks, a new urgency took hold. Repeated failure of traditional methods led some physicians to value first-hand experience. Key shifts included closer patient observation, tracking the course of symptoms, noting pulse and respiration still in crude terms. Skepticism of astrology. Some physicians began omitting horoscopes entirely for urgent cases. Attention to the physical body. Even if dissection remained rare, some physicians began examining wounds, swellings, and skin tone more directly. Detailed case histories. Notebooks began to appear that recorded patient outcomes, both successes and failures. While these shifts were limited to a few innovators, the concept of empirical medicine was taking root. Healing, some began to believe, should not only honor the stars, it should also listen to the body itself. Changing views on uroscopy. Though uroscopy remained central well into the 15th century, cracks were forming in its glassy ritual. Physicians now noted inconsistent correlations between urine color and disease severity. False positives, clear urine did not always mean good health. Patient manipulation. Some patients learned how to falsify samples using herbs or switching flasks. In some hospitals, urine charts were removed from walls. In university debates, scholars question how much could truly be known from a liquid that speaks with many tongues. Still, the symbol of the urine flask endured, its image etched in manuscripts, painted in physician portraits. The ritual was hard to shake. It had become not just diagnostic but ceremonial. The persistent power of the stars. Astrology, too, resisted decline. It was deeply woven into European thought. The Church, despite earlier condemnations, tolerated astrology so long as it did not deny free will. Many patients believed in it deeply and expected it as part of a thorough diagnosis. Some physicians, feeling this pressure, continued to draw charts even as they privately doubted their utility. Others reinvented astrology as a tool of prediction, not causation, guiding lifestyle choices, but not dictating treatment. By the early 1400s, astrology was evolving from deterministic science to personalized advice, still serious but more cautious. Guilds, regulation, and the expansion of medicine. As the physician's image evolved, so too did the medical profession itself. Urban centers saw the formation of physician guilds with examinations and standards of practice. Surgical colleges pushing to separate surgery from barbary. Apothecary guilds focused on quality and accuracy in medicine preparation. These organizations required practitioners to prove competence, not just lineage or education. This pushed medicine further toward demonstrated skill and away from purely book-based knowledge. In Paris and London, licensing boards were formed. Though still dominated by university men, they began to include experienced surgeons, especially those who had treated plague victims, and returned with knowledge that could not be denied. The patient's changing expectations. By the end of the 14th century, the average patient had changed. Suffering repeated waves of plague and the failures of traditional healing, people became more skeptical of authority, more pragmatic in seeking care, more likely to combine approaches. Patients began asking, has this remedy worked before? Do others in my town use this physician? What has he seen, not just what has he read? Healing became practical again, less about impressing with stars and scrolls, and more about results. This shift would only deepen in the centuries to come, as the Renaissance, printing press, and growing literacy chipped away at the exclusivity of the physician's Latin. The lingering duality. Despite all these changes, the conundrum remained: how to balance reverence for ancient knowledge with the urgent, messy reality of human illness. Many physicians lived in both worlds. They read Galen in the morning, examined wounds in the afternoon. They cast horoscopes by candlelight, then stitched a gash by firelight. There was no clean break, only a slow, overlapping shift. Some never let go of the stars, others never let go of the flasks. But quietly, a new kind of physician was emerging, one who asked not what the book said, but what the body did. A quiet moment of reflection. In one surviving letter from 1407, a physician in Lyon wrote, "The heavens wheel as they have always done, but the child's fever does not wait for Saturn. I gave her willow bark and she slept. I am not sure if the stars approved." He did not abandon astrology, but he listened to his patient, and he paid attention to the outcome. That, in the end, may have been the quiet revolution. So as you drift into rest tonight, consider this. How many systems do we still trust because they feel ordered, even when they do not deliver truth? And how do we tell the difference between knowledge passed down and wisdom earned in the moment of pain? Story 6. Anatomy by Candlelight. Dissection in the Age of Prohibition. A heavy wooden door closes behind you. The room is lit only by a pair of wax candles, one flickering above a table, the other barely holding to life near the window, its glow struggling against the darkness. The air is thick with the smell of wax, damp stone, and something metallic. A man in dark robes rolls up his sleeves. On the table lies a human body, pale and cold. This is not a hospital nor a university amphitheater. It is the back room of a cathedral library, or perhaps the cellar of a noble's home. The year is 1412. The dissection about to take place is illegal in this city, but the man with the blade is not reckless. He is a physician, or perhaps a monk, or a scholar driven by quiet obsession. He wants to see what the books will not show him. This story begins in secrecy, in a time when the human body was sacred in theory and off-limits in practice. Yet growing numbers of men sought to understand it not through scrolls, but with their own eyes. A world suspicious of flesh. By the early 15th century, most of Europe still regarded dissection of the human body as deeply controversial. Though not outright banned everywhere, it was viewed by many as a desecration of the body, a possible threat to resurrection doctrine, morally dangerous, too close to sorcery, hubris, or impiety. For centuries, anatomy had been studied secondhand through texts written by ancient authorities, particularly Galen, a 2nd century Roman physician whose works dominated European medical thought. But Galen had dissected animals, not humans, and many of his descriptions were wrong. Still, physicians and theologians alike clung to Galenic authority. To question his writings was to question the very foundations of medical learning. Dissection, rare, ritualized, and restricted. When human dissections did occur, they were rare and highly controlled. A few key details. University dissections were permitted once or twice per year, often using the bodies of executed criminals. Dissections were conducted by barber surgeons, while professors read Galen aloud without watching the body. The body was often referred to in the abstract, the cadaver, not the man. The process was public, theatrical, and deeply ceremonial. But outside the universities, especially in cities with strong religious authority, dissection was discouraged or outright prohibited. This led to a strange split. The official view was that books taught truth. The growing whisper among curious scholars was that only bodies could confirm it. A forbidden practice in hidden places. Thus emerged a quiet network of clandestine anatomists. They were not grave robbers by trade, but they sometimes paid those who were. They were physicians, monks, apprentices, or artists. Some worked alone. Others formed small circles, sworn to secrecy. They dissected at night in monastic cellars, noble homes, university storerooms, abandoned chapels. They worked quickly. The body decayed fast without preservation methods. Each session was a race against time and discovery. Tools were basic. Knives and scalpels, sharpened daily. Hooks and needles. Wax tablets or parchment for sketches. Sometimes red and black ink to differentiate arteries and veins. They recorded what they saw, not always in Latin, sometimes in vernacular, sometimes in drawings alone. These dissections were not for performance, they were for truth. Artists among anatomists. The early Renaissance artists played a surprising role in this quiet revolution. Leonardo da Vinci, in the later 15th century, would dissect over 30 human bodies in secret, producing hundreds of anatomical drawings that still astonish us today. But even before him, artists in Florence, Padua, and Milan began seeking realistic representation, not idealized forms from ancient sculpture, but accurate human structure. They collaborated with physicians, or they became amateur anatomists themselves. They recorded the layering of muscle, the curves of bone, the branching of veins, the structure of joints. These drawings were not widely published, they were personal, sometimes hidden in sketchbooks, but they carried the weight of direct observation. They were heretical not in theology, but in method. Discrepancies in flesh. For those who dared to dissect, the body revealed inconsistencies with the great texts. Galen's five-lobed liver was nowhere to be found. The retia mirabilia, the miraculous network of vessels at the base of the brain, did not exist in humans. The heart did not pump as described. The uterus was shaped differently than the books claimed. These discoveries were not publicly shouted. To do so would risk exile, censure, or worse. Instead, they were passed quietly, in annotated margins, in letters between trusted colleagues. in private lectures to select students. Still, a question had been planted. If the body does not match the book, which one is wrong? The church and the body. The church's position on dissection was complex. The 1316 papal bull De Sepulturis has been misinterpreted as banning dissection, but it actually condemned the boiling and transport of bones, not study itself. Some monastic orders permitted limited anatomical work, especially in Italy. Inquisitors generally targeted blasphemy and heresy, not anatomy. Still, fear was real. Even if not always enforced, social pressure and local laws made dissection a risk. Most clerics and scholars preferred the symbolic body, that of Christ, the humors, or the zodiacal man over the messy, decaying physical reality. Yet in cities like Padua, Venice, and Bologna, a more lenient atmosphere allowed dissections to occur more openly, laying the foundation for later institutional change. The emotional cost. Dissecting a human body in this era was not clinical. It was emotional, even spiritual. Many anatomists prayed before beginning. Some wept during the process. Others reported dreams of the dead, or guilt for violating God's vessel. The work was not taken lightly. These early dissectors often saw themselves as servants of truth, not defilers of the dead. They asked themselves, does this make me wiser or merely colder? Do I honor the soul by studying the shell? Will anyone believe what I've seen? The value of what they found. Despite the secrecy, their observations mattered. Surgeons began using anatomical notes to refine their techniques. Physicians started to question inherited models. Artists transformed visual culture, making bodies appear real rather than symbolic. Some universities slowly expanded dissection allowances beyond ritual. These early dissections were not widespread, but they reframed medicine, shifting the question from what was written to what is seen. And that was the beginning of modern anatomy. So consider this. What does it mean to study a truth that no one else wants to see? And how many revolutions in understanding began, not in triumph, but in flickering candlelight, beside a body no one dared claim. The door creaks again. This time it opens not onto a cold chamber, but into a painter's workshop in Florence. The tools here are different: charcoal, chalk, pigment, but the curiosity is the same. A young man has just returned from watching a hidden dissection in a monastery crypt. He unrolls a parchment and begins to draw not the idealized muscles of Greek statuary, but the raw anatomy he has just seen. The sketch is rough, but it is real. This section brings us deeper into the underground network of anatomical study during the 15th century. As official doctrine held firm, a new class of thinkers, artists, surgeons, and dissident scholars quietly ignored prohibitions. Through whispered conversations, hidden notebooks, and carefully guarded dissections, a quiet transformation of medicine was underway. These were not yet revolutions. They were accumulations of observations, contradictions, and questions, and they would change the nature of anatomy forever. The quiet collaboration between artists and surgeons. Artists, especially in Florence, Milan, and Venice, were among the first to break the boundary between form and flesh. In seeking realism for their sculptures and paintings, they became informal anatomists. Meanwhile, barber surgeons, though looked down upon by physicians, possessed the practical knowledge of incisions, muscles, and bones. Their collaboration was never formalized, but through quiet partnerships they dissected bodies together, often at night. Exchanged sketches, artists seeking realism, surgeons seeking clarity. Compared notes: what does this tendon connect to? Where do the ribs actually stop? Mapped out corrections to Galenic diagrams. One anonymous letter, dated 1442 and found in Bologna, describes: we opened the chest. The ribs curved more steeply than the chart claimed. Maestro B drew while I held the light. We said nothing, only the scratching of ink. These collaborations were acts of shared inquiry, unrecorded in official histories, but essential to the emergence of empirical anatomy. Sketchbooks as medical texts. The formal medical texts of the period were bound in leather, written in Latin, and filled with references to Galen, Avicenna, and Hippocrates. But the true anatomical breakthroughs appeared in sketchbooks unofficial, unpolished, and deeply personal. These books often included drawings of muscle groups, joints, and organs, layered diagrams from surface to bone, notes in vernacular language, often mixing medical terms with common ones, annotations of deviation from Galenic models. Some were created by known figures, such as Antonio della Torre, a professor in Padua, later dissected with Da Vinci; Leonardo da Vinci, whose hundreds of anatomical sketches, though unpublished in his lifetime, offer remarkable accuracy; Jacopo Berengario da Carpi, who by the early 16th century would publish anatomy texts with images based on dissection. But most sketchbooks were anonymous, folded, stained, hidden, used as memory aids or learning tools, not public documents. Discrepancies multiply. With each dissection, more contradictions appeared. The heart did not have 3 separate chambers as described. The liver had 2 lobes, not 5. The kidneys filtered, rather than generated, fluids. The uterus was far more complex than Galen had suggested. These were not just anatomical notes, they were challenges to a system built on textual inheritance. But to say so aloud was risky. Some anatomists began marking their notebooks with warnings. Not to be shown. For memory only. Keep this quiet. Still, they could not forget what they had seen. Dissection as intellectual rebellion. By the mid-15th century, dissection had become a quiet form of resistance. Those who practiced it even secretly were defying academic tradition, which prized commentary over observation; challenging clerical oversight, which insisted the body was sacred even in death; questioning inherited truths, without proposing radical alternatives yet. Some began using dissection not just to understand structure, but to rethink disease. They saw fluid-filled lungs in the dead from coughing illness, hardened livers in the chronically ill, abnormal growths, tumors, or abscesses not mentioned in any text. Without understanding cause, they began to suspect disease had a physical basis, not just a humoral or spiritual one. This quiet shift from invisible imbalance to visible damage was profound. Risk and repercussion. Dissection, especially outside authorized contexts, was risky. Socially, it was considered morbid. Legally, it could invite penalties or scrutiny. Theologically, it was viewed with suspicion or contempt. In some cities, clerics refused burial rites for dissected bodies. Physicians who engaged in unauthorized cutting were expelled from guilds. Even artists who were found in possession of human remains could face investigation, fines, or excommunication. And yet it continued. Because those who saw the body could not unsee it. Because truth, when seen in flesh, pressed harder on the conscience than any passage in a book. The seeds of systematic anatomy. In Padua, by the late 1400s, a shift began. Universities began to allow regular dissections not as ritual, but as learning. Lecturers began to reference discrepancies. A few dared to say aloud, "This is what we see." These were not public revolutions. They were internal adjustments, the slow realignment of belief toward observation. Still, they laid the groundwork for the true transformation to come in the 16th century, when Andreas Vesalius would publish De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, finally tearing down Galenic anatomy with systematic, illustrated, observed truth. But Vesalius's work did not begin with him. It began in candle-lit rooms, with unnamed hands and hidden eyes, dissecting the world one muscle at a time. So ask yourself, what is the cost of truth when it cannot yet be spoken? And how many worlds changed because someone dared to look directly, silently, beneath the skin? A cool morning in Padua, 1537. Light filters through a tall, arched window into an anatomy theater. Benches rise in concentric circles, filled with young men in dark robes and fur-lined collars. In the center, under the gaze of dozens, a young lecturer stands beside a table and a cadaver. He does something simple but revolutionary. He picks up the knife himself. His name is Andreas Vesalius. He is about to dismantle, publicly and permanently, 1,000 years of inherited belief. This final section tells how the slow, secret labor of early dissectors, those who worked by candlelight and in fear, culminated in a visible, structured, and empirical revolution in human anatomy. We will trace the final shift from doctrine to demonstration, from reverence for the written word to the authority of the body itself. It did not come easily, but once the blade moved from the barber to the scholar's hand, medicine would never be the same again. The anatomy theater, from ritual to revolution. By the early 16th century, anatomy theaters had become more common in medical universities, especially in Italy. Padua led the way, followed by Bologna, Florence, and Rome. These theaters were semi-permanent, wood-built structures with tiered seating. Dissections were conducted on executed criminals, usually with church approval. Initially, the lecturer read from Galen while an assistant dissected. But the spectacle began to shift. Students demanded demonstration, not dogma. Some professors began nodding inconsistencies with the texts. A handful began to dissect themselves, shocking to many. And no one embodied this shift more than Vesalius. Andreas Vesalius, the end of the Galenic age. Born in Brussels in 1514, Vesalius trained in Paris and later Padua, where he became professor of surgery and anatomy at age 23. What made Vesalius extraordinary? He dissected with his own hands, abandoning the separation between scholar and surgeon. He questioned Galen directly, not subtly or in footnotes. He believed truth was in the body, not the book. And he insisted that anatomy must be taught through observation, not repetition. In 1543, he published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, an anatomical atlas unlike anything before. Hundreds of illustrations, drawn by artists from the Venetian school. Lifelike figures shown in motion, even posing with flayed muscles. Detailed cross-sections of the brain, the heart, the reproductive organs. Explicit corrections to Galen, citing direct observation. Vesalius marked the moment when human dissection moved from the shadows into the spotlight. Backlash and defiance. Vesalius's work was not universally welcomed. Many medical faculty resisted his corrections. Some accused him of arrogance. How dare he dispute Galen? Religious critics feared his exposure of the human body bordered on blasphemy. But the tide had turned. Other anatomists followed suit. Rialdo Colombo dissected the heart and challenged Galen's theory of blood movement. Gabriel Falloppio studied reproductive anatomy with precision. Hieronymus Fabricius built permanent anatomical theaters in Padua. What had once been secret and scattered became systematic and visible. Still, Vesalius never escaped controversy. He later entered the service of Emperor Charles V, then Philip II of Spain. Rumors swirled, perhaps unfounded, that he dissected a noble too soon or fled the Inquisition. He died in 1564, shipwrecked while returning from pilgrimage, but his work endured. The new authority, the body itself. By the late 1500s, medicine had changed in key ways. Anatomy became a cornerstone of medical education. Surgeons gained prestige through anatomical knowledge. Empiricism, learning by observation and experiment, took hold. The human body, once hidden, symbolic, and feared, had become a site of knowledge. Yet the journey had been long. From fearful glances in darkened cellars, to notebooks hidden beneath cloaks, to lectures whispered against doctrine, to textbooks that dared say, "This is what I have seen." The physician no longer relied only on the stars or scrolls. Now he studied flesh, bone, and vessel with respect, but also with authority. A legacy in motion. Anatomy did not solve all problems. Disease remained mysterious. Surgery was still crude, but something foundational had shifted. Physicians learned to ask different questions. Medical training began with cutting, not copying. The body was no longer a metaphor, it was real, and its structure mattered. Even the church, once cautious, slowly accepted the value of anatomical knowledge, especially as it aided care, surgery, and understanding of divine creation. And the artists who had first sought truth through form continued to shape how the body was seen. Their influence lingered in every textbook, every diagram, every operating theater. A final quiet reflection. The early dissectors, those unnamed men and women who worked in silence, are mostly lost to history. Their notes were burned, buried, or never written, but their hands lit the fuse of the anatomical revolution. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember that every great change begins quietly, that every question asked in darkness waits for a voice to carry it into the light, and that even the most forbidden knowledge once seen can never be unseen.